I'm not here to talk about a particular interesting piece of research, but I'm talking about how we've built evidence and research into the ARC Schools model over the 8 years, getting on for 9 years since we started ARC Schools. It's interesting, people often come and talk to us about ARC Schools and about what we've done and how we've done it. But the strange thing is that there are only certain aspects that people ever come and talk about. Governance comes up over and over again. I could meet somebody to talk about governance in ARC Schools every day of the week if I wanted. But they don't come and talk about how we've built the educational model and how we sustain it sort of through the whole network. I wonder if that's because there's an assumption that everything educational happens at school level and that the centre plays essentially an admin and control function. But that isn't actually how we work. We have a really clear idea of what education in an ARC school is about, and a model that's designed to help make the right things happen both at schools and at central level. And building that model and finding ways of having it evolve and evolve constructively has been absolutely fundamental to what we've achieved so far. So I'm going to talk first about how we built the initial model, and then the second half of my talk is about how we've developed this into something to work at network level for a group of schools. Unlike most academy chains, we didn't start with a highly successful school and a desire to replicate the model in some other schools. We had a very small team, and we were all actually pretty new to education, and it was a bit like this. We dived in head first, and there were various people around who said, "Don't be silly, what are these people? They shouldn't be anywhere near schools," and so on. But we were serious, and we had two big drivers at the outset. First of all was a fantastic group of trustees. Our trustees were none of them in education themselves, but they were all very serious about their philanthropic involvement, and they were putting in big sums of money, and they wanted to be sure that what was being done on the most reasoned and well-evidenced basis to make sure that the most that could be achieved with their money was achieved. And if the most was being achieved with their money, then also with all the much bigger sums of government money that go into academy chains. So we were paying a lot of attention from the outset to what we were aiming to achieve and how to measure whether we were doing it. And then the other piece, ARC is a charity whose job is to improve the life chances of the most disadvantaged children. We always knew that we were going to be taking on some really tough schools and some enormous challenges, and that the people in our schools were always going to be working really, really hard. We knew that we had to do everything we could to make that job doable. So we had to be rigorous about prioritizing, that we had to identify the things that we should be most concerned about, and give as much help as we could to everybody in the network about what they didn't need to do, what wasn't going to be a good use of their time. And in the early stages, we actually did quite a lot of research. I'm talking about research in the sense of reviewing and synthesizing. I'm not talking about going out and doing original research, but we read a lot and we talked to a lot of people. And we read and read and read. We were opening both secondary and primary schools. And in some countries, education is very top-down, and an education ministry or a local authority or whoever pretty much dictates to an extraordinary degree what happens in schools. As we all know, that isn't how it works here. If we tried to set up a model that said, you shall do this, that, and the other, and nothing else, nobody would have come to work in an ARC school, and people would pretty much have laughed. So we had to really review all aspects and think about the things that mattered. We reviewed a lot on curriculum, particularly in English and mathematics. We weren't looking generally at the level of specific programs, but we were looking for some good guiding principles. So one really useful thing in the context of primary literacy was Diane McGuinness's work and the prototype she extracts for teaching the mechanics of reading and writing. We looked at research on pedagogy, on assessment, not nearly as much as we should have with hindsight and with how much I now know about assessment. We looked at school structures, particularly around small schools and schools within schools, teacher pay, general sort of cognitive psychology. We found a lot of good stuff in the UK, many people at the Institute, some of whom are at this conference. I'm very bad at faces, so if you're in this room, I haven't spotted you. But also a lot of American research, and the work on charter schools obviously was useful there. And I can't tell you, when we were starting out, it was hard work trawling through the research, relatively hard work. Nowadays, with sort of Twitter and blogs, and people like Dylan William posting links to interesting studies coming out, and many others doing the same thing, it has become infinitely easier to do that sort of research monitoring job. Really grateful for that. And we weren't just looking for confirmation of existing views, because fundamentally we weren't starting with them. So we approached the whole literature with a pretty fresh eye, and we didn't sort of dismiss things just because they didn't fit with sort of prevailing views. I'm just going to show you one of my all-time favorite academic paper titles, which is The Computation of Conditional Probability Statistics by 8-month-old infants. Brilliant. To quote from the abstract, infants showed reliable discrimination of words from part words, thereby demonstrating rapid segmentation of continuous speech into words on the basis of transitional probabilities of syllable pairs. It's a really important study that showed that even young babies can isolate individual sounds, casting doubt on the widespread theory that word level teaching needed to precede phonic teaching. More generally, the work we did and the sort of preliminary model that we developed for what we thought ought to be in an ARC school helped us to set the early model, and it gave us the confidence to stick to it, despite our relative lack at that stage of educational experience. And the framework hasn't actually needed that much revision, and it helped us by being not worried about being in fashion. We managed to avoid some of the things that we were actually being pushed quite hard 8 or 9 years ago to do. At that stage, for every new academy, you had to write an education brief, and there were some education consultants were paid to review that and advise the DFE on whether it was a good enough brief, and also the DFE itself, the sort of academy teams there were reviewing. We got a lot of pushback on our early briefs. A lot of it was about not being sufficiently focused on making everything happen through technology. So, for example, at one point we came onto why weren't we doing paperless schools? It was a really big criticism of our early briefs that we weren't basing enough on technological information. But we read a lot of research, we read all of Bechter's output, and found that while they'd been able to find some sort of modest motivational effects, there really was very little at that point to show substantive effects on outcomes. So we just didn't build the model around it. Integrated curricula, some great stuff there, but it didn't fit the test of making life as easy as possible for our schools to do well. So great for this. We came across the purple cow, curriculum on wheels. That was one I'm glad we avoided. Reading recovery, we read the research and we went and observed, and it didn't fit well with the prototype that we were building in. And diplomas were another one. We were under enormous pressure to build our model around diplomas, but again, didn't fit the template we'd created. Some of this seems blindingly obvious now, but when we were a tiny team with no teaching experience between us, it was really helpful to know that we had some substance. Talent. We need talent. People talk a lot about schools. We have fantastic people in our schools. We have amazing staff, amazing heads, and they get quite a lot of attention and coverage. But what I'm not here today is to plug everything that happens in our schools. I'm here to talk about how we've made something bigger, how we've made a group that is more than just the sum of the individual schools. So in my metaphor that you're sort of gathering, I've put into this talk, the swimming pool is the school, and the central team are the pool guys who do the work behind the scenes. So if we start with our classrooms, we think about the rest of the school wrapped around those, and the various ARC school support networks wrapped around that, and the wider system networks around that, the future leaders, Teach First, and all the rest. And the pool guys here, they mostly don't get the visibility, but they matter. And we've put a lot of effort into hiring into the central team, people who are both really good and who are interested in the same sort of fundamentals, so that we've got a real intellectual community, which doesn't mean that we have a single opinion on everything. Far from it. There are some things on which we actually have a huge range of opinion within the team, but we've got enough overlap to make it work. And Sophie Blakewell, our education director, was a top-class primary head. Helen Drury, who developed Maths Mastery, we hired from Mossbourne. When we were talking to people about sort of maths, looking for people to lead maths, we found most people sort of unable to lift their eyes beyond the national curriculum. Helen was already sort of alive to all the possibilities. Next Monday, Daisy Christodoulou starts with us as our head of research. We interviewed Daisy. She had taught and she had read and thought and written more widely than anybody else we saw who was interested in leading that function. And we've also got some nice cycling in and out of the centre. People like Becky Curtis, who runs our education support, and now Vanessa Wilms, who's our primary director, come from schools, and it's really important keeping that moving. And we try to learn from our mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. It happens. And we're no exception. And different kinds of mistakes we've made. Some have been structural mistakes. We brought with us a sort of strong desire to try and create sort of small schools, and when the way in which academies were parcelled out made that impossible, we sort of tried to do a school within school model on the back of really very slight evidence, and sort of lived to regret it. It created some sort of fatal compromises, especially around strong subject leadership in schools, so that's pretty much faded away. And some implementation mistakes. For example, in places where sort of quality really depended on fidelity to sort of particular aspects of particular curriculum programs, we didn't always get that strongly enough at the beginning. Now we understand where that needs to be maintained, how to maintain it. I'll talk a bit more about that later. But here I'm going to get to the sort of nub of the swimming pool metaphor. And I've read Dan Willingham. These swimming pools are not idle. When I die, memory as the residue of thought will be found sort of engraved somewhere inside. I want you to take away this idea of the swimming pool as the sort of system metaphor for a group of schools. Because once you've got a group of schools, you really have to think about how to make things happen. We now have 27. You can't do everything directly, and you can't rely on having all the right people in every school at all times to make it happen yourselves. Of course, there are fantastic schools that organise everything for themselves and don't need any sort of system level stuff. It's like there are wonderful rivers, natural pools in rivers, tidal pools. There's not enough of that for everybody at all times. And we think it's sort of unrealistic, especially when, as we have both schools that are at the top of their game and really motoring, but we are also constantly taking in new schools that are typically sort of significantly below potential at the time they come into the network. We have to have systems that will help those. And I'm not talking today about everything that happens in ARC schools, just about the education side. But this swimming pool, it actually makes a very good analogy. Why is that? Well, remember that what I said about not directing everything in our schools. We're not like McDonald's. We don't have a corporate manual that specifies everything that can ever happen. We operate several sort of systems to make sure that the school quality is everything it should be. And I think there are three real elements to a pool cleaning system. So let's talk about those three elements, which are removing the debris, adding the right things, and testing the quality to make sure that what you're doing is doing it right. And each of these has a direct parallel in ARC schools. So starting with removing the debris.